Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best in macro and markets thinking. To see our latest thoughts and analysis on the world, visit macrohive.com. We published some great pieces this week. We have an excellent piece by John Butler on how Germany's Bundesbank is a lot more independent than you think, and the recent German Constitutional Court ruling could therefore be very problematic for the ECB. On the US, we have Dominique Dworf-Racoux, who looks at whether debt holidays and debt forgiveness for small businesses and households would actually be more helpful than current Fed and US Treasury programs. Then we have Caroline Grady, who looks at the relative success story of South Korea and argues that its strong fiscal fundamentals were as helpful as anything during the COVID crisis. On my side, I look at which countries around the world have the strictest lockdown measures and which countries' populations are most and least obedient to their country's lockdown rules. And you'll be surprised by the answers. We also have a lot more on our website and in our Slack channel too. And you can get access to all of this great content by becoming a subscriber. Its weekly cost is less than a cinema ticket. And as you're not going to the cinema, why not join the Macro Hive community instead? On to today's show, we have Bobby Vedral. He's a top macro and political analyst who runs Macro Eagle. He's also the UK representative of the German Economic Council, which focuses on the German-British relationship post-Brexit. Before that, Bobby was at Goldman Sachs, where he was a partner and the global head of market Strats. So on to our conversation. So welcome, Bobby, to our podcast.
Thank you.
So obviously a lot's happened in the world since we've had COVID. And I suppose maybe we could start at the big picture level. And let me ask you, what do you think are the structural implications of COVID for the world, whether that's on the political side, the geopolitical side, the economic side?
Sure. So first, I think what COVID does is rather than change a lot, it amplifies changes which were already underway. If we look at the social, political, and geopolitical framework, the way how I a little bit think about this is in terms of cycles. And political cycles for me roughly last 30 to 40 years. And they are defined by how you think socially and how you think economically. And if you think about it, after the war, we were socially conservative, but economically left Keynes, because obviously, the economy was broken. Then in the 70s, we flipped our social thinking to liberal as well. So we were left liberal. That led to inflation, etc. And then in the 80s, we flipped our economic thinking back to conservative. So we were socially liberal, but economically conservative. And that's central bank independent monetary policy, etc. And what happened really after the financial crisis is because once we saw that banks might be international in life, but are national in death, what turned out was that we became socially way more national. And we became economically more left because of state intervention. And I think this COVID crisis clearly, number one, will increase the role of the state. And obviously not just, and obviously that increases hence the importance of the nation state. And that obviously will have important implications, especially for, things like globalization, but also for constructs that are a mix between, federation and nation state like the European Union. So I think these things will be amplified. What will be new from the crisis is, I think, two important things. First, every crisis like this, especially when it costs money, requires a scapegoat. It has always happened, will happen again. You will have domestic scapegoats, which might be, ineffective politicians. You see this, for example, you see a widespread of popular content with their government. You see, at the top, I would say Canada, Australia, and at the bottom, countries like Spain. But obviously, internationally, there will clearly be finger pointing towards China. And, that will be, I think, an important new element in existing trend. Right? I mean, again, it amplifies something that already existed. It will most likely also amplify another trend, which was, if you think about it, ever since the 80s, economically, and we always thought about shareholder value and efficiency. And it already changed over the last years. If you think in October, I think it was last year, the round table in the US declaring, stakeholder value more important than shareholder value. We see this whole ESG trend is obviously, it's all a trend towards, well, efficiency might not be the answer because efficiency pollutes and efficiency does this and that. And obviously now this crisis has massively increased the importance of resilience, i.e. the fact that you have inventory, the fact that you have a security. And obviously inventory is the opposite of just in time. So I think, especially the role of the state, scapegoats, and hence certainly a break of globalization, global supply chains, open borders, and third, resilience of the economy and thinking, especially in resilience terms, will have a significant impact on politics and on markets.
No, those are all really good points. Maybe I'll pull out a few of those to look into them a bit more deeply. So let's start with the rise or the increasing importance of the nation state. And you mentioned the European Union, which is probably the crucible of all of this, where it touches on so many of these different issues. So how do you think the European Union has performed over the last few months? And what's your outlook going forward?
Well, I think the important thing, to understand with Europe is, now certainly after the Constitutional Court ruling in Germany, for example, markets get very quick nervous on Europe. And there's a reason of why, but I think the market in general doesn't really understand how Europe works. So, in my conversations with, hedge funds around the world or investment managers, they can always talk hours about politics in the US, maybe also in the UK, even in Germany. But when you talk about Brussels and how Europe works, they hardly understand how it actually really works, because obviously it's boring. It's highly administrative, it's boring, and hence there's nothing exciting. But it's obviously crucial. Now, the European Union, I would say the biggest issue it has is that if you think about it, the European Union, certainly since the Single Act in 1986, has been built upon big treaties, and certainly the last big one obviously was Maastricht, 92. But then almost about every 5 years later, there was a small treaty adjusting the big treaties. So you had Nice, Lisbon, Edinburgh, so various small treaties. But that stopped after the Lisbon Treaty, which was obviously the response to the Constitutional Treaty with the great financial crisis. Ever since, we can't open the treaties anymore because opinions diverge too much and too many people want different things. And that's a fundamental problem for Europe because the treaties are meant to be adjusted because unlike, let's say, the US Constitution, which is very principle-based, the EU treaties are very specific. And so you need to adjust them as time goes by, which is why they were always adjusted. And this is a fundamental problem now because we are in a situation where, the framework is not fit for purpose anymore. But you can't open the framework because too many people at the moment have different interests. And I would say, obviously, the fundamental crack in Europe is this, I would say, economic divide between North and South, but also added to that is the value divide between East and West when it comes to migration, rule of law, and these things. And so that is a fundamental problem where if, in theory, the European Union, and even those who created the European Union in the 50s, 60s even said that they said the European Union will get stronger out of crisis because it's crisis which will force it to adjust. But obviously, if the adjustment mechanisms are not available, i.e. if you cannot change the treaties and adjust the framework, then that becomes a big, big problem. And I think from that perspective, hence, what, for example, the Constitutional Court ruling does is it forces the question of, guys, you need to clearly specify what the ECB is responsible for or not. We cannot go on of having a situation where, because the council is blocked by unanimity, and because treaties don't want to be adjusted, that everything just all the time gets solved by the ECB, because it effectively is the only body we have where you have something close to executive decision ability. So from that perspective, I think the European Union, has been on a process of adjustment. But the real question is obviously the opening of the treaties. And the problem is obviously now with the UK out, that the balance of power in Europe has been changed dramatically. I.e., before, roughly, the north, south, and east all had blocking majority, if you looked at the percentage of seats in the parliament under the qualitative majority voting system. But with Britain out, the north has lost it. And so this is why you have really this situation about short-term, obviously being concerned about keeping the union running, but long-term, what are the implications given the new power situation? So I think overall, markets on one hand are far too fast in getting negative on Europe. Having said that, I do think that probably we will enter a period of turbulence in Europe because of this, not just north-south conflict economically, but I also do think that COVID will add to the already existing unrest in North Africa, Middle East. If you look at Syria, Libya, if we look at the locust pest in East Africa, if now COVID hits the continent as well, and we get what we normally get is a migration flow towards Europe in the summer, then you could really in the summer get combination of both the economic and the value disputes. And I have to say from that perspective, it is actually quite useful or fortunate that the strongest country, Germany, is in charge of the EU Council presidency from July onwards, because being the biggest country, it is actually quite incredible, fortunate coincidence that this is happening, that they can steer it in the correct direction.
And in terms of the tensions, who are the countries you watch the most in terms of being the first mover or the person that's going to disrupt the balance the most? Who are the players that you look out for the most?
Well, obviously the European Union is effectively built on the German-French axis. And that is a big concern at the moment, because my personal opinion is that axis probably has never had as bad relationship as it currently has. One can go into the details, but literally the German-French relationship at this moment is not very good at all. But I would say they are both muted at the moment. They are not, let's say, having an aggressive stance. So what you see is a proxy war. And that proxy war is mainly conducted by the Dutch versus the Italians. And I do think that is somewhat of a proxy of Germany versus France. Also, interestingly, you know that obviously, most likely Merkel will be succeeded next year. Also, the Prime Minister Rutte will be succeeded next year in Holland. Obviously, who takes a very tough stance on the whole Eurobond issue is the Finance Minister Wopke Hoekstra. And he is a likely successor to Rutte, so I don't see him changing that stance. On the other hand, obviously, you have a fundamentally weak government in Italy, which needs almost to score points. And obviously now, unlike in the financial crisis, where it was their own, overborrowed banks and created a problem, here the South has a moral advantage, right? That it can say, how come you cannot help me? And I think this creates an interesting potential for conflict. But I think, yes, the most important players to look at, obviously, apart from Germany and France at this moment, is Italy and the Dutch.
And the way you describe this, it does feel like an unstable equilibrium here. At the same time, you mentioned earlier that you felt markets had moved a bit too quickly to price the risks of the Eurozone and so on. So from an investor perspective, how do you think people should position around this?
Well, I think no. What I mean more is, a lot of the pricing is still, within reason. But what I just mean is, people outside Europe very fast become very negative on Europe. This can't work. This will blow up. Now, I think what will be more a problem is that I don't think Europe in these conditions is on anybody's buy list. Let's say like this. I mean, why would you buy in an area that goes through this problem when you mainly have the US as an alternative? That's the market perspective. So I don't think there will be a lot of rush into Europe in the short term. But again, it is these crises by design which have been designed to force change in Europe. And for me, the important thing is that I think the intermediate solution, what will happen is that they will use the budget as a tool to bridge the economic issues at the moment. But again, if they don't adjust the treaties to reflect and correct framework issues in the future, then yes, in my opinion, the EU is unsustainable. But I think for that, what we will require is the new leadership in Germany in order to then hopefully partner up with France and push those treaty changes through. Because the problem is, as long as Germany and France don't agree, you just can't do it, because as long as they don't disagree, effectively Europe will always be split.
And you mentioned the German constitutional ruling, which in some ways is a rebuke to the ECB. Do you think it's going to constrain the ECB in some way going forward? Or do you think this is just more of a procedural thing that the ECB will be able to just manage in its stride and then carry on as it was before?
No, I do think it was an important warning shot, especially if you look at the German text of what he said. I think the most important point it makes is that when it makes reference to Article 19 of the treaty, which is the article which speaks about that it is the ECJ's job to interpret the treaties, that really, in reality, it's an attack not at the ECB, it's at the ECJ, right? It's like saying that we cannot follow the judgment of the ECB. It seems arbitrary. So can you please explain? And it's a warning shot. And what I think what it will have effectively as an effect is that the odd thing is, if you think about it, last week, while in the US they clearly yet again have put out all the bazookas, the ECB last week did not follow up in increasing, for example, the PEPP or the purchase programs. And now that will be more difficult to do, because obviously in the next 3 months you will have to explain yourself. And look, the ECB has an army of lawyers. I'm sure they will find something. But it definitely does not allow you now to create, to just double on the emergency package on, let's say, PPP or something. So I do think it constrains. But also on the other hand, I do think it is a useful argument for the North, especially Germany, because obviously Germany and the North have come under substantial, let's call it moral pressure from the South. And this allows them to say, listen, guys, we do have, rule of law limitations. And I do think it actually will help maybe in the finding of a solution, because it makes clear that, look, if you will push this too much, then the Constitutional Court has no choice but to tell the Bundesbank to not participate in the purchases, which then means that everything goes down.
Yeah, I see your point. So it's kind of almost a clarifying point that forces everyone's attention onto this issue.
Exactly.
And you mentioned Brexit and the UK exiting the European Union and the resulting imbalance it causes. But obviously with COVID, we've forgotten all about Brexit, whether we're going to have a hard Brexit and all these sorts of things. What's your thinking on that at the moment? Where are we? Do you think it will just be delayed because of COVID?
I don't think it will be delayed at all, because to be honest, if you think about it purely from a tactical perspective, without considering what your view is on Brexit, is, before the crisis, we were saying, Brexit, we're hard Brexit, worst case, whatever, economy 10% down over the next 10 years or some. Economy is down to 8%, 8 to 10%. So, there is pretty much nothing you can add to this. So if you do it, you do it now. It's, any impact will be marginal. So, and most importantly also is in these situations where, the Treasury has to borrow billions, honestly, then just use the money for home, right? Why yet again transfer to the European Union? And again, I'm not saying this from a point of view of being in favor. I'm just saying tactically, in a situation where you are, it makes complete sense now to just get it done and move on. Because again, the argument of the economic impact of a no trade is pretty much zero now, and the money is needed at home. So I don't think that the UK will extend in June. I do think there will be, obviously, it's actually Europe who is more interested in extension, I think, by now than the UK. And there will be a lot of, I think, accusation of being irrational and selfish and whatever. But and I think that could have short-term effect on the pound. But I do think that the UK will literally just push it through, and the economic impact of it is a rounding error on the COVID downside. So actually, from that perspective, it is actually perfect timing to just push it through.
That's a really good point, actually. I hadn't actually thought about it in that way, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, any of those forecasts just look like a drop in the ocean compared to what we've just experienced over here in the UK.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned scapegoating domestically within countries and outside of countries will likely accelerate further or be amplified after or during COVID. Obviously, China's in the firing line on the international stage. Before COVID, the axis of the conflict was really US versus China. I mean, do you think COVID will now broaden the front, you could say, where Europe also starts to become much more anti-China and other countries join in?
Yeah, I mean, look, and again, I don't think it's a change. I think it's an amplification of something that was already starting to happen. I mean, also Europe had become way more careful on China, given the cyber activity, and you could see it with the G5 discussions, etc. And absolutely, I mean, you see this now. I mean, I have to say, if you see Australia Prime Minister Morrison asking last week for an international investigation into the causes of COVID, and Australia is highly dependent on China. If they do that, being so highly dependent, then you definitely see that, okay, this is a big shift. And then if you think about it, the Chinese have also been quite active. You see this not just in, there has been military activity in the Strait of Taiwan. There has been different jurisdictions being declared in the South China Sea. But you also see this in, there's a big spat going on between the Chinese embassy and in France for putting out comments on how ineffectual the French response was to the crisis, or China putting pressure on the European Union's External Action Service Strategic Comment Bureau on a paper they put out where they effectively accuse China of activity that seeks to undermine they literally call it disinformation campaign, and literally point that China is doing that to deflect blame from the outbreak, and literally quote, it says, and to improve its own international image. And so you see that that is a quite strong statement from the EU. It was an internal paper which then was published much softened up, but because that internal paper had been leaked, everybody knew about it. And then obviously now the EU is under massive criticism for changing the wording under Chinese pressure. So I would say it's, and by the way, also Germany, which is a high dependency on China for its exports. Also Merkel has now joined Australia and the US in asking for an international investigation. So I think here the problem is the reaction has been quite strong, quite early on, if you think about it, because you would think that let's first deal with the problem and then see later. But I think the reaction has been early on, and on top, the Chinese are taking it very badly. So yeah, I do think that the blame game will go on. And I have to say, normally I would have almost expected the Chinese to agree to an investigation and then just manage that. But the way it's happening, it seems to be very aggressive. And that doesn't look good at all.
And if we go over to the US side of the picture, how do you think the Trump administration has fared during the crisis so far? Thoughts on the election? Obviously, we have Biden now as the Democrat nominee. What are you thinking on the US?
Yeah, so look, I mean, on the crisis, I mean, every country has, dealt with it with ups and downs. I think any country with a metropolitan center like New York has a disadvantage. On the other hand, the hugeness of the US obviously has helped in it not in actually wide divergence in the COVID impact in the different states, which hence explains also why not every state was as happy to lock down like New York. So I think taking everything into account, the US reaction overall was, in the middle probably of most countries. Trump obviously, and as an aside, I mean, always interesting his comments about using disinfectants and stuff. But, what I found interesting election-wise is that now, if you look at the betting markets, they are actually favoring Biden over Trump. And I actually do think that's correct for the simple reason that the unemployment impact from COVID is actually quite high now also in the Rust Belts. Same was true for the agricultural losses due to the trade war with China, which obviously Trump was hoping to reverse with the phase one deal, which is now not happening. And so certainly phase two is not happening anytime soon, and compliance with phase one is an issue. And so if you think about it, Trump lost the popular vote. And to say again that he will lose the popular vote but win the presidency, statistically quite challenging, because yes, obviously people have before won the presidency without the popular vote, but it's certainly not the norm. And to do this twice in a row literally means that the Democrats are not watching the Rust Belt or as Clinton did. And the second thing is that they again, Trump will literally win by a couple of thousand votes in Wisconsin. Now, so I do think that actually the Democrats have, I think now, a relatively good chance. But what is key is who will they pick as VP? So if Biden, again, if I look at the betting markets, the favorite is Kamala Harris at the moment, but I don't think she will be picked purely because she's Californian. And Californian doesn't, she is liked on the West and East Coast, but those are Democratic anyways. So, the alternatives is, it's going to be a she for sure. So it's not going to be Elizabeth Warren, because to be honest, then I think just donors will dry up. And so the choice you have a little bit is either Amy Klobuchar, who is a senator from Minnesota, or Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor of Michigan. And Gretchen is not so well known here in Europe, but she was, for example, picked as the Democratic response to Trump's State of the Union speech this year actually. And so she is actually has quite some standing. And so I think they will pick her or Amy. And why is purely because they are from the Rust Belt. And I think that does swing in their advantage. And again, I think this whole thing will, as usual, depend on, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Wherever these guys go, that's where the election is going to go.
I mean, I guess the question always comes up around Trump surprised us back in the last election. Can't he surprise us now? What was your reasoning for his win last time?
Well, last time I actually thought, and obviously it's evidenced in my writings, that Trump would win.
Yeah, I know, I remember.
But I exactly thought it's two reasons. First, exactly because he wasn't expected, but also I would say Trump didn't win. Hillary lost, and that's an important difference. Because for example, when I was in Boston, at the roundtable of institutional investors, I asked the group who would win, and this was in Boston, which is highly democratic. They were saying Trump, and I said, "Wow, why are you saying that?" And they said, "Because our children won't vote for Clinton." And so I think the problem was Clinton had a very bad brand among young people. And I do think what makes Bernie so attractive to young people is not so much, I think, his policies, but the fact that he comes across as authentic. He's, whatever you can disagree with his views. By the way, like you can disagree with Trump, but you cannot disagree on that both are authentic guys. So while Clinton always came across as a packaged product, almost of establishment. And so I think here, Biden, I would say, is just a nice guy. And that's why I think if they take, somebody from who has, the image of kind of real life person, as I said, I think Gretchen Whitmer is one of them, then you have this authenticity factor back. And yeah, so I think that if you have Democrats wanting to vote, and obviously now the economy will not be in his support, then like I said, I mean, he didn't win, right? I mean, it's she who lost it, number one, and he actually really didn't win. He literally won the electoral vote, and statistically, it's a very difficult thing to repeat that feat, especially because your adversary, the Democrats, have now been warned that how it works. And I think here also one key thing is that so with them knowing where to look at, because really Clinton almost took them for granted, and I think this is also after the UK election, the Democrats are on high notice that the white-collar workers are definitely not guaranteed voters anymore. And I think, like, if you think about it, the Democrats have already been very clever about some of their tactics, especially the fact that, was it Amy and Buttigieg who literally retreated from the race the day before Super Tuesday, which suddenly completely revived Biden. Biden was dead going into Super Tuesday. And he was revived by this tactical retreat because they had learned the lesson from last time that they were far too divided. And I think now here the key question will now be how to make sure that the Sanders voters who couldn't vote for Clinton, how they can now vote for Biden. And that's why the VP is such an important person.
And what do you think about President Trump's using the COVID lockdown or non-lockdown as a election tactic to kind of push that line aggressively? Do you think that makes sense or not from his perspective?
No, I think that what he will do, what he's already doing is, again, focus on China. The problem with that is it's definitely a completely bipartisan line now. I mean, everybody, I think the China bashing will actually be quite strong because it's completely bipartisan. And I think what he will do is literally focus on that. He will definitely try to unlock the economy as fast as possible in order to, now that you had this deep fall, if you can in some way or form structure a V-shaped recovery in Q3, that obviously could be very positive. Problem is just that almost everywhere you look where they have reopened the economy, you actually do see that consumers are extremely careful. And so, I'm not sure it's going to work, but I think his main tactic will be China bashing.
And if Biden was to win the presidency, what's the policy implications of that? What would change compared to the Trump administration?
Well, I do think that this is highly now dependent on the VP. I think the VP on the Democratic side will be a very influential figure, rather than the VPs we have been accustomed to that are, pretty much, as Biden himself said, the easiest job in the world because you don't do anything. But in this case, Biden is not, I would say, too full of ideas himself. And so, let's say he picks somebody like Elizabeth Warren, and let's say he does that in order to get the Sanders vote, right? Then, I mean, obviously we would have a massive shift left. And I do anyways think that a shift left is coming, as I said at the very start, right? I mean, we're moving economically left, socially right. And I think that's coming anyways. And again, it now depends on, in my opinion, of who the VP is. I mean, how strong that move will be.
And do you have any thoughts on the regulation or taxation on some of these big tech companies? Because obviously they've performed relatively well over the COVID period in the sense that they've been viewed as being part of the solution in terms of tracing, tracking, and so on. Equity-wise, obviously, stock market-wise, they performed well. But before COVID, we were talking about regulation and digital taxation and all of those sorts of things. I mean, how do you think that the relationship between politicians and big tech will fare?
Yeah, I think, you're completely right. The COVID crisis has been very good for big tech. But there is good and too good. And I think this might have been too good. in terms of that now they do risk becoming the standard oil, right? That they just become too big. And you see this already in the concentration in the S&P. You also see this in the European discussion of creating a healthcare app that, effectively everybody is falling in line with Microsoft and Google, Apple and Google, on the Bluetooth-based mechanism rather than a state-run one. And it just shows you that, to be honest, Europe doesn't even have an alternative. And I think the problem with that will be that, at least other countries will, seriously encourage the creation of a competitive environment that enhances local competitors, which in theory should obviously be bad for the incumbent. But on the other hand, if you think about Standard Oil, at the end of the day and if you think about the big increase in deficit that's going on, you will need to get those taxes from somewhere. And yes, on one hand, it's great that they are 20% of the S&P, but that also means that they will have to pay the high share of taxes, because there's a reason they're so big in the S&Ps, because obviously they have a high profitability or seen as highly profitable. So I think they will be, in my opinion, the chance of them being hit by taxes will be high. The big question is obviously, almost the savior of big tech is China. Because the big question will always be, do you want to weaken the big tech when there is a big tech battle going on with China? And so that's, that will be the forces that will be playing out. But yeah, I do think that they have a problem coming their way because this was too good.
The other policy, well, especially in Europe, we talk a lot about is ESG and climate change policy. And of course, many other parts of the world talk about it as well. How do you think governments and politicians will view climate change policy, and how will investors view ESG after this crisis?
Well, again, it depends, I think, by country. You can already, for example, in Germany, big discussions that if you bail out Lufthansa, that if the state is in there, then we should, that the state should ask for, requirements to make it more environmentally friendly, etc. I do think for sure that in Europe, for sure, a lot of the fiscal stimulus will go towards infrastructure and renewables, and make it in a way that is environmentally sustainable. Having said that, I think that's what's going on in the real economy. I do, though, think we risk a little bit in the financial market to fall into an ESG trap, because, to be honest, certainly before COVID, but I have the amount of products I see flying around with the ESG stamp on it, where the people who below don't even know what it is quite something. And I think here there is a very high risk of bubble and financial engineering towards creating something that might be pro forma correct, but where the underlying isn't. And so that means, there's a high risk of bubble and money being lost in that respect. And the other thing is, I do think that, if you combine ESG, which obviously already made it very difficult for oil companies to fund themselves, and now you add COVID and the oil price war, and the oil companies being on their knees, I do think, and them cutting back on capex and investments, I do think we have actually a quite good possible risk of oil price spike because of a shortage in supply once this is all over, given that both ESG and now the COVID and the oil price war has increased the risk of lower supplies in the future, and transition towards away from oil will take years and decades. So it's not something we can just switch off like Germany switched off nuclear after the Japanese earthquake. So I do think that there is an interesting combination in this whole ESG and COVID topic in the oil industry.
I feel like we've covered lots of the big topics. Have I missed anything out or not?
Well, I just think on the, maybe the only one thing which I mentioned in my newsletter about this COVID crisis is, in the same way as, when we discussed about Brexit, that I think that, look, what's there to lose now? Just literally get it done, given the economic impact we're already seeing. I think that's an interesting point when it comes to it is actually a very good time for political brinkmanship. And you see this already, obviously, we just discussed the oil price war, that Saudi picked exactly the COVID price, exactly because of it, to pick a fight on oil price, which then obviously went a little bit wrong. But you see the same thing with, why is North Korea again sending rockets in this period? And, it is a time where you don't really have to fear too much repercussion, because it's very highly unlikely that anybody under these circumstances is going to send any armed forces anywhere. So it is actually a time where, from a political brinkmanship point of view, I would expect some aggressive moves around the world. And as I said, we have already seen them, and I don't think that will be over.
Well, on that somewhat somber note, we'll wrap up our conversation.
Perfect.
Now, for the benefit of our listeners, if people wanted to reach out to you or get access to your thoughts, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, best way is just send me an email to info@macroeagle.com. and just state that you want to be added to the newsletter, and then we take it from there.
Great. I'll also include those details on our show notes as well.
Perfect.
So with that, thanks a lot, Bobby. That was a really good conversation, and good luck with everything.
Thank you very much, Bilal.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and let other people know about the show. Also, sign up to become a subscriber to our research at macrohive.com. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.